Good afternoon. It has been such a phenomenal conference so far. Thank you so much for this invitation. I've really enjoyed every moment, so really thrilled to be here. By my name, you can guess I'm of Irish ancestry, but it's not like centuries ago. My father was from Roscommon, and my mom's people are from Mayo, and my grandfather was from Tyrone. So it's really a huge honor to be here today. And we're going to be continuing to talk about Europe and China. So just one quick comment. I had the honor and amazing experience of living in Russia and then living in Russia for 5.5 years and moving to China. And now we're seeing that this kind of Russia-China it has reached a tipping point for European perceptions of what's going on. And a lot of it's determined geographically. But let's start with, first, we're going to go narrow and then spread out a bit. So Julia, I would ask everyone to, if you want the bios, to just refer to the paper so we can actually have more conversation. So Julia is with us today, and she's based in Germany. So my question for you is, the big question is the Franco-German engine broken? Germany has a very, very different approach to China. It's the leading trade with China, and because of that, they've kind of driven policy in Europe. So what's happened? Why don't they see this kind of threat? And how do you perceive the German-China relationship?
Yeah, thanks. So I just have to say, I'm based in Amsterdam. I'm German, but I'm based in Amsterdam. So I think what we just heard in this previous channel about the kind of naive approach of Ireland towards China. And in my perspective, what we are seeing now is a kind of a mismatch between a more serious, more tougher stance on China on the European level, which is mostly driven by the Parliament and by the European Commission, but that is not yet always matched with reactions at the national level. And I think the recent visits of Chancellor Scholz to China symbolizes that very well. So for the Germans have always been driven very much by their business relations with China. For the last 2 decades, Wandel durch Handel, so change through trade, has been the mantra, but the emphasis has been very much on trade, not so much on change, I'd say. And you mentioned earlier that in Ireland, a reflection on this seriousness of China as a new player is relatively recent. But I have to say, in Germany, only last year the German government made a China strategy. And only in 2020 and 2021, the major German parties drafted China strategies. And the China strategy that came out of the government last year sketched China as pretty much along the lines as the European Union does, so as a partner, a competitor, and a strategic rival. So one would have expected this to be a turning point, but no. What we saw with Scholz's travel to China with a huge business delegation, it seems that even though there's more discussion at the security and national security level than there seems to be in Ireland, still in Germany, the German position is still very much driven by these business opportunities. And companies that went to China together with Scholz openly said we still see more opportunities than risks in China. So I'd say here there is a lot of continuation that is different from what we see at the European level. I think the question here is a little bit for how longer can this go on, because there's also some analysts who say that the trade relationship between Germany and China is now reaching a tipping point where it turns to be a loss for the Germans because of various reasons, but where there's still profit made by German investors, but that profit remains more in China and is not going channeled back to Germany. And in addition to that, German companies face competition from Chinese companies, both on the Chinese market, but also on the European market and in markets in other countries of the world. And so at some point, there will also be a loss of jobs in Germany. So, and I guess when we reach that point, it will be very difficult to continue that relationship in a way it has been done so far. Now, we have also seen France's approach to China, which is different. And I think France has their own economic interests to protect. But on the whole, I think France has been calling more for a more coordinated action, and an action that is more strategic and defining the interests of Europe in the first place, and also coordinating more. And that has been, I think, refused by the German side. Not only when it comes to China, also in other issue areas. I think this is a major problem for Europe at that point, because the German French engine, as you mentioned, has always been a motor for European integration. But final point, I think we have, we can see that this didn't work out well in these last encounters with China during the past few weeks. But it's also important not to look only at Germany and France, because after Xi Jinping's travel to France, he went to Hungary, which is the player in Europe that is trying to undermine European values, human rights, rule of law, and divide the European Union on important issues. It's close to Russia. After that, Xi Jinping went to Serbia to celebrate or to commemorate the bombings, NATO bombings of the Belgrade embassy in Belgrade. So this is very symbolic. I mean, how could it be more symbolic? And to me, the symbolism says, if there's no decisive force in Europe that comes up for the European interests, then we make use of that division and pursue our own interests in Europe.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to Andrew now, and she talked about the 2019 white paper and the three-basket approach to China. China sees it as a bit of a fudge, really. They would rather Europe remove the language of systemic rival. They're like, we're your friend, we're your partner, we're not your systemic rival. So they constantly are saying this, are using this narrative in Brussels for them to kind of expunge this language, but everyone knows once you get something passed by everybody and the EU Council, this will never be reversed. So, and others are calling for even sharper language, but there doesn't seem to be any interest from the capitals to do that. So when you think back on it, in 2005, we had the bra wars, and now we have the car wars. So China has really ramped up dramatically. So Andrew Higgins, I wish I had coined this, he called Europe the boring miracle. So is the boring miracle going to really be put in a lot of danger because of Chinese pressure on these systems? And how do you see the evolution of EU-China relations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting, that the boring miracle point. I hadn't heard that, and I think, you know, when you're a boring miracle that's based on democracy, market economics and rule of law, you really have a struggle to relate yourself and organize yourself vis-a-vis and have a relationship with a system that is fundamentally not based on those things. And that would be my view as to why the relationship is problematic. And I think it is worth just going a bit more into the history, as was mentioned, the German change to trade policy. If you look at it from the 1990s onwards, the EU policy, but the policy of most member states, or all member states effectively, was one of engagement with China. And obviously we know about the trade bit, the bit that's probably, you know, more known by the kind of EU-China nerds like me, but not more widely appreciated, was that the EU put in place a whole range of diplomatic and political dialogues. So you had, you know, annual summits, you had dialogue, a human rights dialogue, you had dialogues on, you know, clean technology, dialogues between cities and so on. They're probably not up anymore, but there used to be a diagram on the website of the External Action Service which had this fantastic diagram of all these wonderful dialogues between the EU and China. And in fact, there were so many dialogues at one point that if you spoke to the EU officials and the European External Action Service, they couldn't even tell you for sure how many of these dialogues there were. At one point, it got to 50 plus different dialogues. It was, I mean, the EU went bonkers on this stuff, to be honest. But I suppose the point is, you know, the idea was, you know, through dialogue we build cooperation, we would get compromises, and you know, 20 odd years later we see that that's changed. And then, as you say, from about the mid to late 2010s, there was a big shift in policy, and this was kind of put together then in this 2019 EU paper, which had this tripartite description of China as a partner, competitor, and systemic rival. And that's still the official kind of EU designation of China and the EU's relationship with China. Maybe I think it's just worth disentangling that a bit more. On the competitor bit, it's a bit unclear. Does that mean simply an economic competitor in the sense of being, a market economic competitor? Or does it mean a strategic competitor, in the sense that it's more widely used in the US? On the systemic rival, does it just mean that China has a fundamentally different domestic system to European countries? Or does it even mean that actually, there's a systemic rivalry about the nature of the global economic system? And then the partnership bit, there's not much left of partnership in my view. Partnership would presumably mean that one has something in common with the partner, or perhaps that there's somewhere where the partner and yourself are willing to compromise and find some common ground. And for me, there's not much left of that, and I think we'll probably come back to the Ukraine war, will we, maybe in some of the next kind of bits, maybe.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to move on to Velina now, who really focuses a lot on Russia, China. I called it Xi Jinping's Grand Illusion Tour of Europe, trying to convince the Europeans he doesn't really back Putin, and then immediately Putin going to Beijing. So how do you see this kind of strategic gaslighting, and do Europeans see what they want to see? Earlier panel, they talked about strategic blindness or willful blindness, but it really depends where you are in Europe, I think. So if you're Hungary, that's not an issue. If you're Spain, you open up a new Confucius Institute just a few months ago. Each member state seems to have their own viewpoints, and others have said, oh, Europe has been lost. But being closer to the ground, I kind of wonder about that. There's a cacophony of voices, and there's really no clear EU policy on China. That's my view. What's your take on Russia, China, and the EU triangle?
Well, obviously, the short answer will be yes, that you are correct. So that's the way it is. But there must be more to it, right? Let's dig a little bit into the context and try to provide a little bit of more comprehensive response. First and foremost, let's agree that here in Europe, whether small or big, most of the countries want the same for themselves, and that is more actually of the same. Preserving the status quo, the way how Europe has practically, performed over, let's say, the last 30 years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, has resulted in a standing, global, regional standing that's totally fine for us, right? And I think that the first problem begins with it, that we do not really have any ambitious strategic vision, let's say, for the next 15 to 20 years where we want to be. We would like to preserve it the way it is. We would like to preserve the same share of the cake, but the cake is now actually being quite, let's say, competitive in a sense that we do not have only China, we have also revisionist Russia that is now successfully coming back to the global arena, and it has very clear vision how to do so. And we have other powers, right? The so-called middle powers. So our strategic vision that we want to be a status quo power as a collective player within the European Union and then individually to benefit, to capitalize on that is actually destined to fail. Let's put it that way. And it is destined to fail because it leads, and I don't want to justify the leadership. In fact, being a practitioner, I'm not an academia person, I'm a practitioner dealing with decision makers. I should be very frustrated about the lack of imagination and the lack of action, because as you can imagine, strategic vision reflects on actions, steers actions. But when you have this kind of passive strategic vision, you won't have also the adequate actions. So this is where we are. Let me give you just two examples. First being the way how we look at the global transformative processes and our standing in these processes, as contrary to how China and Russia, and I will say a few things about that as well, look at these global transformative processes and how they want to ride this wave of systemic transformation. And the second being how we actually have missed and underestimated to a great extent actually the re-emergence of Russia that is now shaping the whole continent to at our own coast, at the cost of small but also big players. And final sentence on that matter, in reality, in the global context, even the big European powers that consider themselves being big, such as Germany and France, maybe to some extent Spain and Italy, are not, I would say, middle powers with shrinking leverage and shrinking influence. So the obvious answer to that would be also to, gather all of the knowledge and expertise and experience and to create a collective approach, which is not going to happen. Why? Again, because of the missing strategic vision, which doesn't result in the adequate actions. Now, let me then provoke a little bit the audience and tell you what may come next if we are not coming up with any adequate approach. As I have outlined in this book, which is a book more on Russia, but it has very much to do with China, as I've been meticulously following everything related to China and Russia for more than 10 years now. And when I say meticulously, I mean on a daily basis. So it's not only China that is systemically looking at us. I would argue we Europeans, we had these qualities and this expertise and this know-how during the Cold War to also meticulously watch, observe, and adequately assess our competitors or enemies. And we should go back to this mindset. Now, first major, let's say, mistake that we do is to not admit to the reality. We do not want, and I mean our businesses, our industries, and our political decision makers. I'm not going to focus on specific country. I would say that is in general in Europe the case. We do not want to admit that the Cold War 2.0 scenario is a realistic scenario. And I mean Cold War 2.0 not just with China, but actually with China and Russia. Have you read anything about it? Have you had any significant debate, public debate, or debate at any closed door or whatever kind of formats? Because I can assure you there are no such debates, there are no publications, there are no books, there are nothing. There is nothing on the possibility that we may be sliding into such scenario. But in reality, if we take a look at the actions right now at both China and Russia, Russia obviously focused on Europe, and again, what did we do? We've scaled down the possible outcome of Russia's actions by just giving a label to Russia as the junior partner of China, a junior partner that could not just win a war against the second largest European country, but actually could destroy the whole European security architecture, and by doing so, it could do the homework for China to create a situation in which the West is being kept busy on the old continent, while China has the time to prepare accordingly for what comes next, namely the Indo-Pacific systemic competition with the United States and the Pacific allies of the United States. Because let's be honest, the messaging that came from Europe, if there would be a military conflict in Taiwan, or if there would be any kind of serious military aggravation in the Indo-Pacific, that Europeans want to be left alone, that they do not want to interfere, that they may introduce sanctions, but that's it, right? So once again, we see a clear dichotomy between perceptions, vision, actions. Final point, because I'm leaving, of course, some space for the discussion afterwards. Obviously, those countries that are now geographically closer to Russia and those who have the DNA from the Cold War, from the first Cold War being on the other side of the Iron Curtain, have a specific knowledge and specific expertise as to what may happen next when dealing with the Communist Party. And I would argue that they could be very useful next to, of course, the institutional approach. The institutional approach, however, will not come from the European Union. It will come from another organization that I'm sure Ireland doesn't want to hear about. And I'm saying this because I come from another country that doesn't want to hear about it. That's Austria. And this institution is NATO. That is not for this panel. But obviously, why? Because NATO was the institution that was dealing with the Soviet Communist Party and has the DNA to deal with this kind of threat. So here I argue we need to start thinking about the threats and challenges that are coming out from a modus vivendi of systemic coordination between China and Russia. The threat multiplier that is China together with Russia. Why? Because Russia would have never ever started a full-scale war against Ukraine if he had not relied on the comprehensive, long-term oriented support from China. And China now similarly relies on the comprehensive long-term support from Russia in dealing with the United States.
All right, well, thanks for that, Velina. Well, I'm sure this will be picked up in Q&A. And Professor Tsang, who's just written a magnificent book about Xi Jinping, perhaps you can tell us what she wants from Europe. And why doesn't Europe get more out of China? They're not using their leverage. But tell us what your views are about what China's vision for the future is for Europe and the world.
China wants a united European Union when the European Union is dealing with the United States of America, so that Europe is a different pole from the United States. China also wants a divided European Union when it deals with China, so that the European Union will not do what the European Commission President says Europe should do. China is not thinking so much about Europe per se. I mean, it does think about Europe, and I'll come back to that and some of the points that Velina has already mentioned. China, under Xi Jinping, thinks global. I think we mislead ourselves if we think that China thinks in regional terms. It doesn't. Xi Jinping thinks completely globally. He does not have an Asia-Pacific initiative. He does not do a greater common future of Eastern Asians. He has a common destiny for humankind. He has a global initiative, well, 3 of them, for development, for security, for civilization. The guy is completely thinking in global terms. And what he wants is effectively to put in place an alternative international order, one that is, from his perspective, vastly better, more equitable, and superior in every way to the existing liberal international order, which from the Beijing perspective is an international order of the West, by the West, and for the West. And he says what he wants to do is to, in quotation marks, democratize the international system. What he says, therefore, is that China is not going to create an alternative world order to replace the liberal international order. He is saying that we like the liberal international order, but we would like to take it over, transform it, change it, with the support of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world and the overwhelming majority of countries in the world who happens to be in the global south, whatever the global south means. But it means basically whatever it is that is not the so-called democratic West. And there is a serious argument. It has a lot of attractions if you are dealing with autocratic leaders in less well-off countries in the world, where they are being promised through the Belt and Road Initiative development loans without conditionalities, where they are being reassured through the global civilization initiatives that they have the right, just like any other country, one country in particular, or a grouping of countries, US or collectively the democratic West, none of them have a right to tell the autocratic countries in the developing world what kind of system, what way of life they should have. They have equal right to that. You support China in the international organizations, including the UN, you can do that. Now, this is where the EU does come in. If the EU functioned as an alternative pole, is divided from the United States, there is no one collective democratic West functioning effectively to uphold the liberal international order. This is where the partnership with Russia comes in. I mean, where I would underline is that we found it convenient to describe that partnership as in terms of Russia being the junior partner. But Russia is an important strategic partner for China because Russia under Putin is doing a fantastic job undermining the credibility of the liberal international order. You can't do that. You can't change that liberal international order without it being discredited both by the Russians doing it, by the EU functioning separately from the Americans, and with the support of the global south pushing China, which is, as Xi Jinping calls it, forever a part of the global south, therefore the natural leader of the global south, to make that change for the argument of doing it for the best interest of most people and most countries in the world. That's what we're dealing with, and we have to take that squarely.
Excellent points. The whole idea, I remember when they were trying to lift the arms embargo, and because China was always trying to cultivate Europe as a separate pole. And when Europe was unable to lift the arms embargo, they're like, that's it, you're useless, you're no good to us, you're not a separate pole. But we see the person who uses the term strategic autonomy even more than Macron is Xi Jinping. And I mean, they really, Macron, when he was in Xi Jinping's force field in China, I mean, he went there to talk about peace, you know, try to use your influence on Putin to end the war, and he left with the bumper sticker, we're not a vassal of the United States. So you could just see Xi Jinping's influence on him. And I think that's their goal, to divide the West, to find any openings and then drive a wedge in it. And I think, you know, French, there's no one on this panel who's from France, but you know, they're uncomfortable. I would tease my colleagues, oh, you're in the same basket as Serbia and Hungary. You know, that's how China sees you, that you're all kind of anti-American and you're open to other opportunities with China. So I think Macron's visit with Xi was a little bit more nuanced than it was in China, perhaps. And I think maybe the Chinese are even confused, you know, by some of the things he was doing. And, but I think that the message he's told to Serbia and Hungary is like, you're the future. You know, this is how I want my new community of common destiny to look. You know, you're looking towards the East, not towards the West, and you have a very different approach. So how do you see Germany fitting into all of this? Because you have a coalition government, you know, it's very complex. People are getting frustrated. There's a tipping point. The Chinese had a really smart strategy of cultivating, you know, 3 key industries. So the car industry, the chemical industry, and like Siemens. And at one point, Siemens was like losing market share in China. And in fact, they kind of, several years ago, I had dinner with someone from Siemens who told me, frankly, we can't get any further in China. All we can offer them is deals outside of China in a third country. And so China twigged onto that, knew that these companies had the chancellor's ear, and so they gave them a very good contract to entrench them further, to entangle them further in the Chinese economy. Because as long as these big companies have the chancellor's ear, that will kind of have a huge impact on German policy on China, which kind of is leading a bit in Europe. So the BDI, the German Federation of Industry, published in 2019 this document that was really the basis or heavily influenced. Things were cut and pasted literally from that document into the EU white paper. So there's such a difference, like a disconnect between what the BDI says and what Chancellor Scholz said. And I was in Berlin recently, and someone told me OWD was written on the document about the port agreement. And Olaf Scholz, it's a very key port. There's been 6 ministries against it. NATO wasn't thrilled by it. The European, in Brussels, they weren't thrilled by it, but someone wrote, Olaf wants this, OWD, so it just doesn't matter. We don't care what other ministries say. So how do you characterize what's going on? We're trying to tease out what sense of direction is going in Germany. You said that there's some sense that people are losing jobs. It's the jobs creation is in China. Where do you see this unfolding?
So I guess you're better informed on the details than I am, I have to say. But I see Scholz as not a very strong visionary leader. That's very clear. And he's dealing with a difficult coalition. And so I really can't, I was also surprised when I saw the port project going through, and the explanation that was coming out was that he has been the mayor before, and so he wanted to draw in investments locally. So, but to me, this is a very weak defense, honestly. So I really can't make my mind how this went. I'm also a bit in this whole debate. You don't see China featuring strongly. So it's right now what's going on in Germany. It's about right-wing parties that are threatening the whole establishment. So I think, and this came up earlier also. I think the domestic politics in democracies are really at this point. Inhibiting European countries to actually focus on what's really important in the long term. And also, on the other side, this also makes it very difficult to sell this message of democratic values, because it has not worked for many countries in the global south, and now it doesn't work very well for many countries in Europe. So how can we, or how should we continue to march under this flag of democratic values when it is really hard to show good examples?
And with Maximilian Krah, we see this espionage case, and and if people are willing to take money from Russia, it seems that they're willing to take money from China. It's like like people who work for tobacco companies are happy to work for alcoholic companies. So the Chinese invest in all parties, but it seems that they've had the most success in the far right. So building on that, how did Europe get into this position? You talked about Wandel durch Handel and this idea of money has no color. If we hug them close enough, they'll be our friends, and they'll look like us. And I remember going to the European Parliament. They had a photo exhibition of democracy in China. That the EU, this was one program that the EU was promoting, and they went to villages and they had voting. That didn't age very well, but I've got all the photos to prove it. But so it's only recently that Gunnar Wiegand's favorite excuse was always, we don't do geopolitics, right? And now with Ursula von der Leyen, they woke up, there's this thing called geopolitics. So and they don't have geopolitical muscle. So why is it taking, how can there are certain constraints on their actions, and member states kind of aren't happy with the direction I think that the Commission's going.
So, I mean, I think one starting point I would say is that in a sense, we in Europe believed our own rhetoric. So, there was the policy of engagement, and to be fair, if you went back to the 1990s and 2000s, China had liberalized economically. There was a degree of, albeit limited, of political liberalization within China. So there was at least some reason to hope that this might even proceed further. And China's policies on Taiwan or South China Sea and so on were more moderate in some ways in the 1990s and 2000s than they are today. So I think there was some cause to believe in the policy that the partnership and engagement would lead to change within China, but also add into that I think that we believed our own rhetoric. And thirdly, then purely self-interested. If you're a kind of a German car making company, or if you're an Irish government minister, and an American chips company comes to say we're going to build this chips plant in Ireland and it'll export these chips to China, do you put your hand up at the cabinet table and say, colleagues, I'm a bit worried that there might be some security risks about this? Or do you say, colleagues, this is great, we're going to have all these jobs and we're going to show our voters and the economy will be booming? I mean, kind of politicians are often, short-term self-interested in that sense. So that would be, my sort of explanation of how we got to all of that. And then, when a policy is embedded, it then becomes very, very difficult to change. And maybe just to kind of take on your kind of France and the strategic autonomy point. The EU, as we all know, it's partly a composite of its 27 member states, and they have different positions. So on this strategic autonomy thing, you have France and some others, maybe Belgium would be one of the obvious others, who really want to push for kind of Europe taking on, Steve's point, as a kind of independent pole. But then you have others within the EU, Britain, which obviously is left now, but also, particularly the Central and Eastern Europeans, who are much more the EU needs to be a partner of the United States. So the EU is kind of internally schizophrenic on this strategic autonomy point. The way I think about it sometimes is people have sometimes referred to as a strategic triangle of the US, Europe, and China. And is it kind of an equilateral triangle, or what kind of triangle is it? My own view would be that ultimately Europe has more in common in terms of interests and more in common in terms of values with the United States than it does with China. So that, Europe, including the EU, will be, in my view, closer to the US than it will to China, but Europe and US positions are not going to be identical at the same time.
Well put.
Theresa, can I
please.
Come in here? I think Andrew's raised a point very, very important that we need to underline. When he talked about in the 1990s and the 2000s, engaging with China was the default position in governments and in the corporate world. He's really, in a sense, underlying that we see China in the light that we want to see China. It happened then, it happens today. Just swing to the other side of the extreme. Neither is going to be very helpful to us. We need to see China for what it actually is. The slight difference of China providing an alternative world order to replace the liberal international order, China engaging in a Cold War, seeking to replace the United States, or China trying to transform the international order in a different way with a different conception, is the kind of difference that does make a difference. And we need to get it right. If we don't get it right, we can't get the policy right. And we have to guard very strongly against simply seeing China in the light that we are used to, or we would like to, or is currently fashionable or politically correct.
May I also add something important, and I absolutely agree with you, Professor. I would even argue it's no longer just about strategic autonomy or whatever kind of buzzword We want to pick for the sake of intellectualism and to, do our intellectual gymnastics here in Europe and feel very smart about it. It's really about strategic survival. And we may laugh about the statements of French President Macron for different reasons, that he's overambitious when it comes to words, and then nothing happens when it comes to actions. But in this particular point, I have to agree with him that contrary to all other European states, whether small or big, they haven't developed any kind of strategic vision about anything that's related to Europe's position in the world. So we should not be really bitching about the fact that he at least tries to develop a strategy that doesn't consider only France, but considers Europe's place in the world. And the very fact that he was clear about the possible demise of Europe, and even that did not result in any significant debate and in any sense of urgency. As we speak, we are in a third year of full-fledged war and no sense of urgency. And then the French president is coming out and says publicly, Europe may die. And by the way, here, when it comes to strategic survival, I want to make the point that I don't see a strategic triangle between United States, Europe, and China. In fact, it is clear bifurcation centered around two powerful strategic rivals, probably two superpowers in very different ways, two technical frontrunners, the only two powers that are currently frontrunners in the fourth industrial revolution, which are willing to ride the wave of the fourth industrial revolution are China and United States. And we know how this ended. We are here very close to another, a powerful, now it's more in the history, global, powerful actor who has managed to ride two waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first and the second, which enabled Great Britain to become what it was. And we know how actually it ended in the Cold War with the third Industrial Revolution, when there were again two superpowers in the front, seat. So here there will be some tough choices. Are we going to, align with the one front runner? Because otherwise we will be cannibalized and we will be swallowed by the competition. And I think what we are also not discussing is that Russia has made its strategic choice for itself. Russia is no longer a superpower, but it is a great power, and Russia wants the pole position in this systemic rivalry. Russia wants the first role by siding with one of the two systemic players. So here the question for us is, if we are no longer able to receive the cheap raw materials, not only from Russia, but in the long run from China, as it seems, when it comes to digitalization, when it comes to all this, green transition. And then if we are no longer relying on the security umbrella from the United States, and in the long run are not going to get the access to the Chinese market, what are we?
But I think I resist the Cold War framing, because the Soviet Union didn't trade with the rest of the world. China is the first trade partner of over 120 countries. Cold War is going to look like a cakewalk compared to all the entanglements we have today. And we, as you pointed out, we have to understand this. We have to right-size China. We have to understand the challenge. Even the great historian Stephen Kotkin gave 6 scenarios. There's 5 published in Foreign Affairs, but he added one. And he added like the cul-de-sac of history for his speech at the New York Public Library. So I think that even someone who's spent his entire life studying Russia or the Soviet Union, then Russia, who's writing like his 3rd volume on Stalin, he's not sure where they're going. And I mean, we're really at a very, very difficult point in history. That's why we have these amazing discussions, because we're not clear of what's going on. And I think that to just say this is what's happening and that's it, I think that Putin will die eventually, and even what he does in North Korea is something that really irritates Beijing, because by going to North Korea, it creates more of a security threat for other countries in the region, and they want to increase their defense spending, Japan, South Korea. So he can rattle the cage, and it's not like he's a vassal when he behaves like that. So these kind of neat narratives, I think, are dangerous. I think we have to be learning right now and trying to figure out what's going on. And this idea of I've heard this so often, if we're nice to China, we can pull them away from Russia. As if Europe has all that agency. I'm like, what? Where are you? So I see you signaling. Open the floor to questions, please.
Yeah. I think this has been a fantastic panel, and I want to probe a little further into some of the points that folks have raised here. Thank you. Hello. Am I on? Yes, I am. Great. Okay. First, Steve, you've mentioned, and I've thought a lot about this issue of this community of shared future for mankind. And so, one question I have for you is, one reason the Soviet Union was attractive was because it had a leftist ideology, a workers of the world unite ideology. Come along with us, you're part of the proletarian revolution. China has a make China great again strategy. It's a revanchist country. In my perspective, it's a fascist country. It's a rightist country. So how attractive is this community to the global south? I know China really wants it to be, but if you have a strategy that's really focused on your own development and the others are just affirming you, come to China, say Xi Jinping's great, okay, thanks, here's your roast beef and go home. How attractive do you believe that to be truly in both the global south and in Europe? And I ask this question because in Africa, China takes a very different tone. In Africa, China doesn't say the Europeans and the Americans are different. In fact, they say the Americans and the Europeans are just the same, and they're both the West, and they're both raptious, and they're both colonialists, right? So how effective do you think this messaging strategy is? And then the larger question for the panel is, we have seen the Chinese economy in a tough position, right? But it seems to me that there's this idea that the Chinese economy is still what it was a few years ago, the lag in terms of an expectation and an assumption that China is continuing to grow, and in reality, we know that there are all these problems because we study this issue. How long do you believe it will take for the bloom to come off the rose, and for people to understand that the future of China's economic growth is not the past, and that to think of China in economic terms is to fundamentally misunderstand and to project the past into the future, which is not necessarily appropriate?
Okay, yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much. Evans Van Lewis, University of Galway. My question is for Professor Tsang. So, within the context of China's domestic order, domestic politics, Xi Jinping has been very vocal about this idea of new China as a harmonious society. To the extent that you're right that you're saying that he's thinking globally, but I wonder to what extent he wants to externalize this vision of harmonious society and think about a harmonious global society. And if it is to be a harmonious global society, what is his recipe of success? How he is going to do that?
I'm looking for other questions. We can group them together. Oh, yes, the young woman.
Hi everyone, my name is Nuria Zaiden. I am Uyghur and have been living in Ireland more than last decade. I'm Irish citizen, and you may know since 2016 there's more than 1.5 million Uyghur people arbitrarily detained in concentration camp. First China was denying, then they was saying this is re-education camp. But among those detainees, there's my professor like Ilham Tohti, so many medical doctor, retired person like Dr. Rushan Abbas. And we know China becomes second largest economy. And those economic development very much significantly depend on depend on exploitations of colonized region like our region, the people, and how important to bring forced labor. Same like this month, US added 26 companies in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act list. So how important to bring Uyghur Forced Labor Act, similar act, or forced labor to EU and European country or Ireland?
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, those are 3 questions. I know we're the last panel before lunch, and that's always an awkward position to be in. But those are excellent questions. The attractiveness of Chinese narratives, you had 2 directly to you. The idea of harmonious global society, you want to address that? And then the idea of Uyghurs and forced labor. We saw the EU dragging their feet on this type of legislation, and it was actually direly watered down, but at least it got over the hump. So why don't you start, please?
Right. I wanted, actually, if I may, start with the very last question. I thank you for raising this at this forum. I think it is a positive thing, a good thing, that when we talk about China, we should always flag it up. What happens in Xinjiang is indefensible, intolerable, and we should take that seriously, even when there are not, in fact, a huge amount we can do about that. Sorry that I can't say more in terms of what we can actually do. I think the attractiveness and the harmonious society thing, 2 questions, probably I can address them collectively together. In terms of the attractiveness or not of the Chinese model, I take everything that Joshua has to say. I agree with what you say. China does have a China first policy. But then what we need to bear in mind is that China's appeal to the global south is effectively based on a kind of, in quotation marks, beauty contest conceptualization. And beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Whether what China has to offer is attractive or not depends on whether the people who are being targeted, who are the autocratic leaders of countries in the global south, not the general populations in those countries. I think we know for a fact that in a lot of those countries which form partnerships with China, the general population are a lot less keen with that relationship than the leadership. But what the Chinese have to offer, compared to what Europeans and Americans have to offer, make what the Chinese have to offer quite attractive, even if it's very transactional. But the price the Chinese ask them to pay does not have to be paid by them or their country. They're asking those countries' leaders to give China support at the UN, at international organizations, to support China's claim over Taiwan. What's there not to like? How much does it cost them? Nothing. Whereas the Americans and Europeans are asking for them to change their governance, to provide transparency and accountability, that costs them. And that's why the Chinese offer is actually a lot more positive. And that is where I think the issue of the harmonious society being exported or not really does matter. Now, the harmonious society effectively has been phased out under Xi Jinping anyway. But even if it had not been phased out, it doesn't really matter too much, because Xi Jinping made it very clear he is not trying to export the Chinese model. He does not export the Chinese way of governance or system. They are there for you to draw inspiration. You want to learn from it, great. But we are not imposing that, we're not exporting that. We are not doing the Maoist export of revolution or the Leninist, Stalinist era export of socialist revolution. By not exporting the Chinese model, again, it actually makes it less imposing on the recipient countries, and therefore easier for them to accept.
Okay, then. I'm looking at the time, so why don't you, all right, first of all, are there any more questions for this panel? Yes?
Niall Duggan from the Department of Government and UCC. My question is based around the idea of strategic autonomy. There was a study done by the Port of Duisburg that the cost of minimum level sanctions against China would increase the cost of freight by almost 1,000%. It was just slightly under 1,000%. Given the cost of living that would affect in Europe, can we really talk about Europe's ability to be strategically independent of China as an economic actor, given that we're quite exposed to China, particularly for people at a lower level income, in terms of the effect that would have on people's cost of living?
Okay. Yes?
Yeah, thank you. I'm disappointed that no one addressed the question about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is essentially a very state-of-the-art kind of arrangement, because, you know, if Nike does something bad, there may still be alternatives, but if Apple uses, you know, it relies on the supply chain that uses forced labor, it's like most people really have no way to you know, no alternatives. And so the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, because it imposes the burden on companies, it is very, very effective, and hopefully that, you know, the rest of the world, as the democratic West, I suppose, quote and unquote, should really adopt that act. And then another thing is, it's kind of like, I've always been scratching my head, why is it that so all these democratic West countries would support, for example, Palestinians, but then look the other way when it comes to the Uyghur situation? Why is it that China has its own colonization and imperialism, and yet it basically gets all the passes? And when you criticize China, you're labeled anti-Chinese, rather than, you know, when we criticize Trump or Biden, we would never be labeled as anti-American. So why is it that China's narrative is so effective for the global South?
Okay. All right, I want to give, I'm looking at the time, so I want to give everyone on the panel a chance to pick up these points. I do want to say, good point, and also I'm ashamed that it took the EU this long. I mean, it's baked into the US DNA. Since the 1930s, there are no forced labor laws. I mean, there's like no, you're not allowed to have forced labor in your supply chains. That's since the 1930s. We're in 2024, and the Europeans are like, we're all about values, you know, and then they're dragging their feet, and it's almost completely unworkable. I mean, it's just, there's so many opt-outs or carve-outs, it's obscene. And when they say they are for values, except if there's a nice little price tag on the end, things cost money. I mean, values have a cost. And this is something that, in my view, Beijing loves. As long as it becomes transactional, that makes them so happy and comfortable, because you're not talking about your values anymore, you're just talking about transactions. But I defer to you now, please.
Thanks. I was actually, your question about why is China's defensive narrative so successful, that would have been my answer to your question, Josh, about the soft power of the Chinese model, because I'm sometimes wondering, I mean, yes, there's development, the narrative that China brings development and maybe wealth, but sometimes I'm also wondering whether it's really so important to the Chinese that everybody buys into the narrative that the Chinese model is better, as long as the narrative actually prevents anti-Chinese narrative from emerging. So I think sometimes this is the most important goal of that whole narrative diffusion. And of course, why is that so successful? I think the Chinese put a lot of money and effort into spreading that narrative and making others, silencing other voices, even abroad.
Okay, I mean, there's loads there and great questions. Thank you very much. I'll try and take them to a degree, all of them, but pretty quickly. On the Uyghur situation and Xinjiang, absolutely, and thank you in particular for raising it. And I would absolutely agree that, you know, my view would be that Europe should take a much stronger position, including, you know, something like the US kind of forced Labour Act. We can discuss why maybe that hasn't been the case, but certainly I would support that. On Josh's point about China's economy, I guess there's always a lag between reality and data and our recognition of it. Two things. I think one, already to some extent what China is able to offer to the developing world in terms of loans and so on is not, you know, as much as what it was able to offer maybe, you know, 5, 8 years ago. The other thing I think we've already seen a change is until quite recently, probably the mainstream view, including perhaps in the US, was that China would at some point in the next 10, 15 years overtake the US as the world's largest economy. I think most people are now revising that, and I think that's correct, and that's a pretty important shift to recognise. On the appeal of the Chinese, not the Chinese model, the China's vision for global order in the global south, for me, I think one thing, and I describe it as the shadow of empire. If you think about, the legacy of, 500 years of European colonialism and empire casts still an enormous shadow. So for most people in Africa, Latin America, Middle East, they look at the world from that prism. And China comes to them as saying, we are in favor of a balanced world, democratizing, as Steve put it, the world order, changing the existing world order. If I was, African, South Asian, Latin American, Middle Eastern, that would probably appeal to me. So I think that, that there's just a huge shadow of history, which lends credibility to China's vision in much of the world. For myself, I would say we should actually be trying to call that out. If you take reform of international institutions, I would love for the G7 to come up with a real plan to reform the UN Security Council, for US, Britain and France to get together and support that and put it back to the Chinese and Russians. Say, are you willing to give up your veto? Will you let Japan and India be on the UN Security Council? So I think, there might be there are genuinely positive reasons for that, but it might also call out Western hypocrisy. Niall's point about, strategic autonomy, I mean, absolutely, the downside of all this economic engagement is that we're now, very heavily invested in a broad sense in the economic relationship with China, and you can look at how China's been able to use that with the example of Australia, which comes to the de-risking and this question, well, what is de-risking? How far should we go? The de-risking versus decoupling debate. And, one could make a case actually that, not overnight, but over time, arguably, we actually need to decouple from China to a degree economically. Whether that's realistic, discuss.
Okay, I'm getting a signal about time, so why don't you quickly make a comment and then wrap it up with Steve then? Okay. Do you want to comment on any of those questions?
Well, I think I took already a lot of time of this panel, and my colleagues actually covered most of the points. I'm also glad that I'm not the last one to finish this, panel discussion, because I don't have, a lot of good news for you. I mean, I'm the strategist. My time horizon is 15, 20 years. If I take a look into the future, Europe in general, let's put the term Europe as a collective term for the European Union and the member states and the partners, is in structural and in systemic decline that is going to last at least for the next 15, probably 20 years. We're gonna probably have Iron Curtain 2.0. I know that this terminology from the first Cold War is certainly not the most fitting one. We will come up with new terms for sure, but Iron Curtain 2.0 moving eastwards means including Scandinavian, Central Eastern European countries, and practically Russia, if successful, of course, in Ukraine. And I think that right now it looks like that for the moment, the way how the West or Europe behaves. And with obviously now the clear signal coming from China for the second time, by the way, that Beijing will do anything to support Russia in its endeavor to win the war, and really anything. So that means, of course, that then we will get a punch in the face by the reality that at that point of time, political decision makers, but also industries, society are going to have to face the reality. And you remember what happened the first time. At some point of time, collectively we will come up with actions, and that means the cognitive warfare, obviously, coming from China and Russia. We didn't have the time to discuss that, but what is going on right now in the global south is practically also warfare over the hearts and minds of every single state and societies there.
If Velina did not have good news for you, I have worst. And my worst news is that I think if we use the Cold War 2.0 paradigm, we are grossly underestimating the kind of challenges we actually are facing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cold War 1.0 was fundamentally something that was containable and was contained. And in the end, we won. The new challenge we are facing is much worse. It's much worse because the Soviet Union worked grudgingly within the liberal international order. China does not accept it. In Cold War 1.0, there was no immediate issues that would pitch the Soviet Union and the United States in a military confrontation. There is Taiwan, which Xi Jinping will resolve within 25 years, and that's the time frame he has set. It's not going to be allowed to last for longer than that. And this leads to my third point, which I think we really need to bear in mind. If we think about it in terms of simply de-risking and decoupling, and if we then reduce the economic engagements we have with China, we have no leverage to deter China from attacking Taiwan. Conventional military deterrence cannot work because there's nobody in the Chinese military system who would dare to tell Xi Jinping that we should act on American or Western military deterrence. It has to be something that Xi Jinping himself will see. It will utterly and totally devastate the Chinese economy to the extent that his hold to power will be threatened. If he thinks that's going to happen, we can make that threat and make it credibly, he will not invade Taiwan. We cannot do that. We are going to have to deal with the consequences of a Taiwan crisis. God help us at that time, if we ever get there.
All right. Well, so we thought we were going to change China, but China has changed us. It's imported corruption, economic dependency, and eroded our values. And as this panel ends on a very pessimistic note, I wish you all a very good lunch, and we'll have more conversations. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.